Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Young. I am the CEO and co-founder of Classcraft. I'm here with Professor Chris Dede. We are going to get started in 2 minutes, just to give a chance for people to arrive and settle in, and then we'll get started. So sit tight, and shouldn't be more than a moment. So for people still trickling in, we're going to get started in just 60 seconds, maybe give a chance for people to connect. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sean Young. I am the CEO and co-founder of Classcraft. And welcome to talk number 3 of our Chat with the Experts series. We've been doing this through the month of August and probably continue doing it through the fall. What we're doing is, we've come to realize we really care here at Classcraft about effective instruction practices and research in education, and a lot of the work we're doing is predicated on research, and realize that it's really hard for educators to have access to research, either because there's a lot of it and it's hard to sift through, or they just don't have time, or it's books and that takes a lot of time to digest. And so we thought we would go straight to the source, get the researchers, and have an open conversation with them. This is a fireside chat, so we're going to just be exchanging here on various topics. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest here today, Professor Chris Dede. Hi, Chris.
Thank you so
welcome.
much for inviting me, Sean. I'm excited about the chance for this conversation.
As am I. It's always a pleasure to exchange with you. So I'll just share your bio here before we get started, so everybody knows what you're about. So for everybody listening, Chris Dede is the Timothy E. Worth Professor in Learning Technologies at Harvard's Grad School of Education. His fields of scholarship include emerging technologies, policy, and leadership. From 2001 to 2004, he was chair of the Harvard Grad School of Education, Department of Teaching and Learning. In 2007, he was honored by Harvard University as an outstanding teacher. And in 2011, he was named a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. In 2020, Chris co-founded the Silver Lining for Learning initiative. You can find that at silverliningforlearning.org. So that's silverliningforlearning.org. He's also a member of the OECD 2030 Scientific Committee and an advisor to the Alliance for the Future of Digital Learning, sponsored by Mohammed bin Rashid Global Initiative. Also, Chris is a co-principal investigator for the NSF-funded National Artificial Intelligence Institution in adult learning and online education. His most recent co-edited books include Teacher Learning in the Digital Age, Online Professional Development in STEM Education, Virtual, Augmented, and Mixed Realities in Education, Learning Engineering for Online Education, Theoretical Contexts, and Design-Based Principles, and also the 60-year curriculum, New Models for Lifelong Learning in the Digital Economy. So really honored and happy to have you here, Chris. Having worked with you in different settings, I can attest to, the quality of your teaching skills and also the deepness of your thoughts. So looking forward to exchanging here today. I got a little icebreaker question, the one I'm doing with everybody here. So, before we get started with, the actual conversation, just wanted to know what's your hobby?
Well, for as long as I can remember, very early in my childhood, I was fascinated with games. And that was long enough ago that what I had was board games, physical markers, physical dice, and so on, and card games. And of course, when internet games came out, that was very, very exciting for me because it added a whole dimension. And although I don't have the kind of time to put into games that they really require, I like swords and sorcery. I like space, um, internet games. So um, it's not a surprise that I'm a big fan of Classcraft because I'm a longtime gamer.
Hmm. That really resonates with me. Also, longtime gamer. Started with board games myself, so hopefully you can get some more time to do that with. How did you get into education research, Chris?
Well, I had always planned to be a scientist and went to Caltech, graduated in chemistry, had a PhD set up at Harvard with a full scholarship. And instead, I went to UMass Amherst in science education. And everyone thought I was crazy, but I have never regretted the decision. And when people asked me why I had done this, made such a dramatic career change, my answer was that I had hated school. I hated school, every second of school. High school was the unhappiest time of my life. I was a nerd
Same,
when being
same.
a nerd was not cool.
Yes.
And I would read the textbook for the first 2 weeks and then I'd be bored for the rest of the year. So um, it was natural for me to go into education, science education. And then as technology came along, I sort of morphed from a science educator who used technology to a learning technologist who grounded a lot of examples in science. And research was just a natural step because you need research both to design things that are really interesting and to figure out whether or not they're working and why they're working.
And so tell us a bit about, some of that. You've been doing this job for a while. So tell us a bit about some of the research you've done throughout the years.
Well, I'll talk mainly about my current research, but I'm happy
Hmm.
to go back in time as well. So, as you mentioned in your introduction, um, I am co-principal investigator for one of NSF's 18 National Artificial Intelligence Institutes. And the particular one that I'm involved with is on adult learning and online education. So this is really workforce development. This is people
Mm.
24 and up. How do we help them initially skill, upskill, reskill, switch careers, and so on?
Upskilling and reskilling are learning new skills while you're already, in the workforce, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of upskilling. So we're developing AI-based teaching assistants for university professors as
Mm.
part of this work. And so I'm going to be surrounded at some point by teaching assistants who are machines, who share my job with me. There's one for answering questions, there's one for tutoring, one for the lab, one for the library, one for social interactions among students. They're all narrow, but there's a whole suite of these things.
Hmm.
Now, if I don't change what I'm doing, I'm de-skilled because the machines are taking over part of my job. And in an odd way, I could even end up working for them. The question assistant says, well, I can't answer this one, so you do it.
Right.
But if I take advantage of the fact that the machines are doing this sort of um, easy parts of the job, the parts that can be automated, then I can upskill. And by upskilling, I can do more deeply the human parts of the job that involve deep understanding of students' cultures, more time to build social interactions with them, and so on. So One of the themes that led NSF to create these AI institutes is that we're moving towards something that people call not AI, but IA, intelligence augmentation, where a
Mm.
person and an AI working together can accomplish things neither one can alone. And we're trying to look at how that might influence every part of work, but then preparing workers for every part of work.
It's so fascinating because, for a long time, most people were imagining AI doing, more automatic, robotic type tasks, like, working an assembly line or whatever it is. And we're seeing more and more, and at a very fast rate, I have to say. AI is coming into things that we would have more identified as, creative fields. An example that there's a lot of AI generated art now. And and 2 years ago it was finicky and kind of dumb. And now that people can look these up, there's DAL-E #2. There's also Midjourney. These are producing incredible pieces of art with just by text inputs. And so a lot of the things that used to be in our minds, oh, machines will never be able to do that, are actually, the progress is in my mind pretty impressive. It's happening a lot faster than I thought it would, and I've been keeping track of this.
The progress is impressive, but it's important to remember that what machines do is derivative. It's
Mm,
kind of combining and building on things that already exist. You're not going to have a machine develop a whole new form of art, although it will be able to copy that once a human being does that. It's a
mm,
little bit like dogs. I remember when I heard that dogs could sing, and I was excited, and I looked at YouTube videos, and sure enough, but it didn't take long to realize that although they could sing, they didn't sing very well. And
mm,
I think that that's where we are with AI, is that people are
mm-hmm.
doing this kind of gee whiz stuff, and then they realize, well, no, actually, there's a narrow range of things that AI can do well, and there's a broader range of things that AI can do, kind of like the dog that sings.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that there's, like, the potential at which these AI, bots, for lack of a better word, are progressing? Is there a point, like, it feels to me anyways, that the point in the future isn't that far off, where telling the difference is going to be hard.
I think that that's not true, even though you're right that the trend line looks that way. And let me give you a specific example why. Um, Oncologists, cancer doctors now have AI assistants,
Yeah, yeah,
and those assistants do things that no doctor can do. No doctor can scan 1,500 medical journals that day to see what
that's
new
right.
has been published. No doctor can examine the current records of 2,000 cancer patients with similar illness across the world and see how they're doing and make recommendations about treatments.
Informed judgment about that.
Yeah. So data, the processing of enormous amounts of data that human beings can't assimilate is there. But you never would want the assistant managing the patient because the assistant doesn't understand pain. It doesn't understand death. It doesn't understand culture, and that cultures have attitudes about death. Religions have attitudes about death. It doesn't understand what the economics of the family might be if the breadwinner dies. And that some human beings might prefer quality of life and others would prefer quantity of life. Those are all very human things. And no matter how fast AI gets at crunching data, it doesn't have a body, it doesn't have a social or cultural life, and it doesn't have morals and ethics. So
Mm-hmm.
it's never going to catch up, but it's going to take over jobs if human beings let themselves be de-skilled
Mm-hmm.
instead of doing the kind of upskilling that I was describing. The cancer specialist has to upskill to more deeply understand all these human dimensions of the patients that they're advising.
So a future of work that is defined by, upskilled human beings with AI assistants. What does that mean for education? What about teachers?
Well, the brief that we've written on this is published by the Next Level Lab, which is part of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So now that's a second hat that I wear, other than this National AI Institute. We have a brief on intelligence augmentation. And what it says, basically, is that machines do reckoning and human beings do judgment. Machines are really good at absorbing data and making predictions based on that data.
That's reckoning. That's what
That's
you're calling
reckoning.
reckoning. Okay.
And people are good at understanding what decisions to make based on those predictions. So think of
And
Data,
that's
the
judgment.
android in Star Trek, and then
One of my
Captain
favorite
Picard.
characters of all time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Data is the reckoning machine, but Captain Picard is the wise human that makes the ultimate judgments. So it's intelligence augmentation. Science fiction has long portrayed different forms of intelligence augmentation. So the problem is in education, what are we teaching? We're teaching reckoning. No, we're teaching people to lose to AI. The SAT, the GRE, all the Gaokao in China, all the high stakes tests are reckoning. That's what AI does. So teaching the human side, the judgment side, is a huge shift that we need to make if we're going to be able to harness the benefits of IA instead of getting the disadvantages of IA.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think, it's been a truism for a while that, all the academic knowledge that we need to learn in schools, we can learn on the internet. And, what's the role of school? What I love about what I'm hearing here is, you're speaking specifically to the competencies tied to, relating to information and data. And as we move towards, an increasingly data driven age, however we want to call that, those skills become really important to be aware of and to distinguish. So what do we do today? Like, what would a teacher do today to, you know, try to teach towards judgment as opposed to reckoning?
Well, if you think about how we try to teach judgment now, business schools will use something like cases. Law schools will use something like mock courts.
Yeah, simulations.
Simulations. Medical schools will use internships and residencies based on simulations. And we can do really enormously sophisticated simulations now. Some of them are built on internet games. So, it's the internet game engines that the entertainment industry has developed that lead to really powerful learning by doing immersive environments. My colleagues and I, over a 20-year period, built 5 different curricula that illustrate the power of this. But now, what I find interesting is that I'm an advisor to a company called Immersion. So I have a stake in Immersion, but I have a stake in them because I really like what they're doing. They are like a flight simulator for human skills. So think about the Wizard of Oz. There's the wizard, the big thing on the screen, and then there's the little man behind the curtain. With immersion and similar technologies, which are called digital puppeteering, a skilled simulation specialist can play up to 6 or 7 virtual people simultaneously. And so now you can put a teacher in front of a class. You can put an employee in front of a meeting of the bosses. You can simulate all of these difficult situations in the way that pilots face different difficult simulations in a flight simulator. And you can learn where there's low stakes instead of high stakes for doing this. So we have ways of learning by doing now through immersive learning that give us the chance to build judgment based on reckoning as opposed to just teaching reckoning. But that requires a sort of a shift in how we think about the curriculum standards, how we think about assessment, how we think about a lot of other aspects of education.
That's interesting. I mean, do you foresee a future then where that's, kind of the norm and stable for K-12 kids? Because I mean, there's cost prohibitiveness there for sure, right?
Sure. Well, there's it's interesting. You mentioned the Silver Lining for Learning series.
Hmm.
In March 2020, when everything shut down because of the pandemic, I and several other experts in online learning, each of us a professor at a different university, sort of got together and we said, we got to do something because everyone is going to have to be doing remote learning and they're
Yeah.
not prepared for it and it's going to be a mess and we need to try to provide some advice. And we wanted to do something completely bottom up because we didn't want anybody telling us what to do. No brand, no sponsor, no
That sounds
link
like the
to a
Chris that I know.
university, just, just
Yep.
us, funding a little platform and every week having a kind of a show. And we said our show will celebrate people who are succeeding under the pandemic. That's the silver lining, that the silver
Mm.
lining, the pandemic undercut the dead hand of the past and the compliance mentality of the present so that people could truly transform. And we all across the world, we said there are these stories. We're going to highlight the stories and celebrate them and talk about how they might spread and go to scale. And we said, 5, 10 weeks, the pandemic will be over and we'll stop doing it. Well, we just hit episode 118.
Wow.
Episode 119 is this Saturday. None of us saw this. But what we have now is this wonderful archive of multimedia cases of
Mm.
innovation all across the world. And I would say that at least half of those cases are from global South countries. They're not celebrating, privileged
Hmm.
innovation, even though
Hmm.
we have some certainly that celebrates that. They're celebrating what people can do who have almost nothing. And the message is that far too often, people who have an enormous amount say, well, no, I don't have X, so I can't innovate. I don't have Y, so I can't innovate. You look at these silver lining for learning episodes, you see people, with chewing gum and string managing to do something truly wonderful. It's
Wait a minute. What are
humbling.
they? What are they doing with chewing gum and string?
Well, that's,
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm
that's
taking
a
you literally.
metaphorical statement. That's a
For
metaphorical
sure.
statement, but they are, so the episodes are a nice kind of proof, or at least
Hmm.
a demonstration that there's a lot that can be done in terms of transformation that doesn't require a lot of resources, but it
Totally.
does require the ability to step away from all the constraints. And the pandemic provided a temporary window for doing that. And now we're all hoping that we don't just go back to the same old out of habit when we wouldn't have to.
We have some comments and questions coming in on some of the live streaming. What are your thoughts on AI's capacity to mimic, for example, empathy? And although you were talking about earlier AI, there's things AI won't can't do and will never do. We could imagine, the range of human emotions to be part of that. Um, at what point does mimicking become the
Well,
same as the
yeah.
actual thing?
Well, it's an interesting question. Early in my career, 50 years ago, there was a professor at MIT named Joseph Weizenbaum, and he was a natural language expert. And he felt that natural language had progressed to the point that you could trick people into thinking they were talking to a person when they were talking to an AI,
Right.
not by making the AI smart, but by using a bunch of simple tricks. And the way that he chose to do this, there was a famous psychologist at that time named Carl Rogers, and he decided to create a Rogerian therapist that he called Eliza. And so you'd go to see Eliza, she would be your therapist. You'd say, I had a rough day today. And Eliza would say, that
Tell
sounds
me
really
more.
hard,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And every once in a while, Eliza would say, well, how does this relate to your mother? Or how does this relate to your father? It was nothing but tricks. There was no real AI behind it at all.
Mm.
Well, Weizenbaum shut it down and he was horrified and he wrote a whole book about it because people were spending hours and hours talking to Eliza, thinking that they were getting therapeutic advice, when Eliza was simply a mirror that was reflecting back to them what they were saying. And that is still the case today with much more elaborate AI that does have some AI in back of it, but it still doesn't understand emotionally anything that human beings say to it. And
Well,
so,
can I challenge something though? Like what
sure.
dawns to me when you're saying that is like, why is that so horrifying? I mean, people get there's therapeutic value to processing your own feelings and emotions,
Well,
regardless of who's on the other side.
there is therapeutic value, but why not process them with a human being with whom you're building a real emotional connection, with whom, if things go sour, they can really express a genuine understanding of you based on a model that they have of you in their minds, rather than a machine that won't have a clue about what to do if you come in and say, I'm feeling suicidal, except it's going to say, well, I hear that you're feeling suicidal.
Right.
So
Right.
the issue isn't that the process is a bad process. The issue is that the target is a bad target.
Mm.
Now, Sherry Turkle from MIT has written about this. You've got somebody in a nursing home. Nobody is left in their families. Nobody ever comes to visit them. Is it such a bad thing if you give them a robotic companion? And one can argue that either way. But widespread to think that talking to an AI is as rewarding as talking to a human being. Tactically, maybe yes. Strategically, no, it's a total disaster.
Mm. Mm. There's a comment here, 1977 novel called Gateway by Fred Pohl that has an example of a good AI shrink. So for those listening,
science fiction is a very, very rich medium, and there's lots of variations on this theme, including a lot of the holodeck stuff in Star Trek that really anticipated. The whole metaverse is anticipated in the Star Trek holodeck. So I find that often science fiction writers have done a really good job of sort of looking at the upside and the downside and the ethical issues.
Thinking through these issues. There's another comment here that says, AI assisted humans is this similar to chess champions that are, using computer assistants, and maybe a follow on to that I'll add is, at what point does, I guess this goes back to your point earlier about, if the machine's doing all the work, then you've de-skilled yourself, right?
Well, it depends on the task. So chess is 100% reckoning. And at some point, an AI is going to be able to do chess far better than any human being can, because there's no judgment. It's all about reckoning. Most tasks involve a mixture of judgment and reckoning, and the cancer specialist is an example of that. So the trick is human beings need some amount of reckoning. It can't be magic, because otherwise they won't know if the AI is performing well or not. But when I was a kid in school, we got all these worksheets, paper worksheets, the multiplications and divisions, and I was the best in the class. I could do them faster, I could do them more accurately, but a $3 solar powered calculator can run rings around me. I mean, that's not going to be my career. So analyzing the task to begin with is the first step. And teaching is a really interesting example, because part of teaching is reckoning, sure. And that's why people keep thinking, well, all you have to do is get a Nobel laureate to do a lecture and put it on video and have kids watch it, and your job is done. But a huge part of teaching more, and class, of course, recognizes this, is social emotional. It deals with motivation in complex ways. And it also deals with individualization in ways that AI it's getting closer. And this institute that I'm part of is working to get it closer, but it's never going to be able to take over the judgment side, in my opinion.
Well, and let's shift gears here. You just mentioned motivation here. You've done a lot of work around motivation and student engagement in the context of ed tech. Recently, you coined a term, universal design for motivation. What are we talking
I said
about?
I was going to write a paper on that, and unfortunately, I still haven't written the paper. But I do.
Maybe an AI assistant can help you.
Yeah, maybe so. I do have some thoughts about the topic, though. So a little bit of context. About 15 years ago, I looked at the curriculum in the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I saw that there were probably 70 courses on learning and 0 courses on motivation. And I said, this is crazy. And so I decided I was going to teach a course on motivation because nobody agreed with me that this was a problem. And there wasn't any point in teaching a theoretical course on motivation because, of course, the Harvard Psych department had wonderful courses like that. So I decided I was going to teach a course on applied motivation, where how do you engineer different aspects of motivation into a learning experience. And I say different aspects because motivation is not synonymous with engagement. People talk about the two as if they're the same, but engagement is one dimension of at least 4 in motivation. And my course is about all 4. And so part of the universal design for motivation is the idea that you've got to have all the dimensions. You can't just say, well, if they're engaged, then I've solved the motivation problem. Everybody seems to think, well, there are universal things that everybody finds motivating: dinosaurs, volcanoes, space, zombies. You see all this stuff. Every education commercial has, this kind of stuff in it. Wrong. People are motivated, engaged by very different kinds of things. And so universal design says personalization and motivation is as important as personalization in learning.
Okay, wait. Let me repeat that. Personalization and motivation is as important as personalization in learning. So if we want to do that, what are those dimensions? You mentioned engagement is one.
So engagement and flow, right? People talk about, in games especially, people talk about getting into flow because they're so engaged that they're just using every brain cell they have to try to accomplish something. A second dimension is self-regulation and executive function, because you can be enormously engaged, but if you don't have a way to channel that energy in a disciplined manner and to deal with hot topics in terms of emotion as well as cool topics in terms of emotion, you're really going to struggle with your motivation. And we know that there are lots of children who are struggling in school because they don't have executive function up to the level that our curricula demand. So that's a second dimension. Then there's beliefs. What do you believe about yourself and what do other people believe about you? Because growth mindset is a belief, self-efficacy is a belief, stereotype threat is a belief that comes from other people. Bias is a kind of belief that we encounter from other people that we have to factor in, that can really undercut our own motivation and learning. And then the fourth dimension is dispositions. And that's a little less familiar as a topic in education, but dispositions are really important. And we see that because of the pandemic. I know people in the pandemic who have roughly equivalent knowledge and skills, but one of them was paralyzed by the pandemic and one of them was empowered by the pandemic. The difference is their dispositions. One person is tenacious and resilient and curious and innovative, and the other person is not. And that's what makes the difference. So
How is that different from the beliefs? Like, aren't those tightly interconnected?
not necessarily. I mean, you can believe um, and have that you can do something well. You
Mm-hmm.
have high self-efficacy. But even if you believe you can do it well, that doesn't mean that you choose to do it well.
I see.
The choice to do it well is more of a disposition. So for
So it's
example,
like
being
the bright kids in the back of the class that are kind of lazy and not engaging.
yeah,
if I
exactly.
if right.
So there's at least those four dimensions to motivation. That's as much as I can cover in a semester anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so universal design for motivation says you can't just focus on one, and you can't just say let's maximize them all, because actually if students are always engaged, they never develop tenacity.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's a
Mm-hmm.
complex system where these can reinforce one another, they can undercut one another. And so the design of motivational interventions is as complex as the design of learning interventions.
It's super interesting. I mean, a lot of the work we do at Classcraft is around, designing for motivation. I mean, that's literally the point of Classcraft, is to afford for teachers tools and a platform so that they can redesign their classroom in a way that, fosters intrinsic motivation. And of course we borrow from games because those are systems that are designed to do that.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times, we'll get questions like, well, is this more motivating for boys versus girls? What about kids that don't play video? And my answer to that is always, well, we've looked at so many dimensions of motivation where, yes, you're right, like leveling up an avatar, maybe not so motivating for all kids, but real life privileges and powers that allow you to control your day-to-day life, that's super motivating for you. And actually, we've got a mix here. It's like I describe it as a interconnected web of all these different functionalities and features that play together to create optimal motivation situations for a wide variety of learners. And
Exactly.
you know
Exactly.
and that's what we're trying to do, right? But I guess one question that dawns for me is, a lot of our thinking was based on like self-determination theory. So we're thinking
Mhm.
about competency, right? The perception you have of progress, or that you are achieving mastery. We're motivated by situations like that. Controllability, being able to make decisions, and relatedness, so being able to share or experience these things in a relevant way with other people. How does that match to what you're talking about? Because those are like three different
Mhm.
elements of it. Is it a different theory? Is your framework sitting on top of that? How does that play out?
Well, motivation is a tricky field because
Mm-hmm.
people use the same term to refer to different things. They use different terms to refer to the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Every once in a while, somebody rebrands something that's been around
Mm-hmm.
forever and claims that it's new. I mean, it's just typical of the social sciences. And I certainly don't at the end of the course, I don't say here's a 50-item checklist. And if you're trying to engineer motivation into something, I mean that's very demotivating, right?
Yeah,
To be
yeah.
faced with a 50-item checklist. So there's overarching umbrellas that reflect what all the little parts inside are working towards.
Mm-hmm.
Relevance is really, really important. And one of the big problems in school, of course, is that kids see
Of
zero
course.
relevance to what they're learning. And unfortunately, often they're right. And as AI gets better and better at reckoning, they're going to be even more right about how irrelevant a lot of this is for them. Another is agency and feeling that you have some control, that you are taking responsibility and authority over your own learning. That's very, very basic. And we also want people to graduate with that. We don't want people to graduate with really high test scores, but they have to be micromanaged every single day
Mm-hmm.
because all
Mm-hmm.
that they're used to doing is fulfilling somebody else's detailed demands. And so the big buckets that you described are absolutely that. And some people would say, well, there's 3 buckets, and some people would say, well, there's 5 buckets. But if you compare all of these
They
frameworks, they're all
overlap.
really talking about the same thing.
It's like the 30 odd different SEL frameworks that
Exactly.
have different competencies and different, but at the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's the same general buckets. I see. And so, you know, I think I want to just dig in a little bit more on this nuance around engagement because I agree. I mean, I often sum it up as engagement is doing things, motivation is wanting to do those things. But and that may be wrong from a research standpoint, but I do think the word engagement is so overused in education, and I'd be curious to hear like what's your real definition of what's the Chris Dede definition of engagement here today. Well, let's get it on record.
Sure. So I have an interesting way of starting the course. Typically in a course, the instructor will say, here's our discussion forum. Why don't you begin by posting, something about yourself? What degrees do you have? What jobs have you held? The standard kind of bio information.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In my course, I say, don't post any of that stuff. Tell people what you do on a regular basis that you do because you enjoy it so much that you keep coming back to it.
That's like my "what's your hobby" question.
That's like what's your
That's
hobby
right.
question.
Yeah.
And that accomplishes 2 things when you have 50, 60, 70 people posting. One of them is that everybody is astonished because the range of stuff that people post is so wide. And the person that posts that they really enjoy cleaning their house, that every Saturday morning they really, really enjoy cleaning their house because it gives them a sense of accomplishment, and then the house is beautiful, and so on and so on. And for somebody else, that's the most demotivating part of their entire week is when they have to clean their house. And so you get this sense of how personalized engagement is when you have people describe, the different things that they're engaged by. But then the other piece of it is the students realize that they know each other much better than the other kind of introduction. Because if you're meeting a stranger and you had to pick one thing to know about them that was going to reveal many, many other things, it would be what they're engaged by. It wouldn't be what degrees they have or even what job they have. It would be what they're engaged by. And so it's really a great way to start the course because it makes people realize that these are deep waters. And,
it's so interesting because it really matches, so I run a company. I've interviewed lots of strangers throughout the years and in the hiring process. And I never asked them, like, tell me what your career was. I'm like, I got that on the paper, and I always start with like, what are you passionate about? What are your hobbies? Like, what's one value that would define you? If it defines your behavior. And that really resonates with me, what you're saying. But where I'm going with that is we've heard so many times candidates say like, this is the best interview process I've ever had. Thank you so much for actually trying to get to know me. And it's just fascinating to me that like, these are the important questions, but they're not the ones that we're asking so often.
Yeah.
Like the fact that that's surprising to them, it's surprising to me. Right.
And if my students are taking the course ultimately because they're interested in how you engineer motivation.
That's right.
But the first thing that you have to understand is that what motivates you is not necessarily what motivates other people. And just as with learning, where a teacher teaches something and says, well, these students are stupid, they're not getting it. because I would certainly learn perfectly from this. Well, yes, you
Yeah.
would.
Yeah.
That's your learning style, but it's not their learning style, and so you're failing. Same thing is true with motivation. People design something that would be enormously exciting for them, and then they dismiss all the other people who aren't engaged as unmotivated. They're not unmotivated. They're just motivated by different things than you said that you were using. So you have to get beyond yourself. You
You
have
know what
to.
was a life defining moment for me in that realization? I was playing World of Warcraft, and this was back when it came out, and and I think game makers know what you're talking about really well,
Yeah,
because
they
I'm
have
playing
to.
World of Warcraft. I started at the exact same time, incidentally, as my mother-in-law at the time started playing World of Warcraft. And 6 months later, I'm talking. Oh, so I'm like, "How's your World of Warcraft going? What level are you?" And she's like, "Oh, I don't know." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" She's like, "Well, let me check." And she's like, I had powered through and got to the max level and as fast as possible. Like that was my goal. And we're playing the same amount of time this game. And for her, she's like, "Oh, I'm like, where are you in the world?" She's like, "Oh, I never left the starting village." In 6 months, she's like, "No, I'm level 18. I was level 70." And she's like, "I've just been helping people who are new to the game and help chatting with them in the village and telling them where to go." And that was for me, like, and I was like 20 at the time. It was a light bulb moment for me of just like, whoa, like we're having completely different experiences
Yeah,
on this medium. And I think
yeah.
games know that, like, really good games are able to cater to different types of motivation for sure.
When I taught the course this last spring, I always try to find ways to make it better. And so students had the options of playing one of 6 different games. And it was a big enough group that for each of those people, there would be 6, 7, 10 other people playing the same game. And so you could have a little community about it. And the games were just really, really different from one another because the point was to show that what a game is can be defined very broadly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But the most popular game, and the most popular game the last several years, is called GRIS, GRIS, which is gray in Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about grief.
Hmm.
And it's a very powerful but very unusual exploration of the grief process. And some students, because there is a lot of grief in the world right now, some students say that they really got a tremendous amount out of this. But again, it just shows that the range, the range of what engages people, what they find of value, varies. It varies for each person and varies at different stages of their lives.
One question that came in here through social media is, for you, Chris, is, do you think that learning designs that encourage positive interdependence are underutilized? And if
I
so, why?
do. I do think that they're underutilized, and I think positive interdependence is important in life, and so we need
Can
to
you
make
can you
sure
define that here?
that
What
it's
what would
important
what
in
would that
school.
mean?
Well, it's sort of like the whole is more than the sum of the parts. That in a community that's working well, whether it's occupational or hobbyist or spiritual, whatever the community is, people are feeding off of each other in a way that makes them more than what
Right.
they were alone.
I see.
And too often in education, deficit models are what pervade the field, not positive models. So one of the things that I say early on in the course is um, privileged students are assumed to have to be kind of better than marginalized students by many people. And the idea with marginalized students is, well, they're kind of broken, but we're going to go in and fix them. We're going
Right.
to help them get up to where the privileged students are. Actually, from a motivational perspective, it's the privileged students that often are well behind marginalized students. Marginalized students have enormous amounts of tenacity and resilience. Marginalized students often are deeply engaged by learning because they understand how important it is. It's their route forward. So, um, starting with a person's strengths and assets and helping them express those strengths and assets to others and to use others to help them grow where they don't have the strengths and assets, I think is exactly the right way to think about this. And you can label it in different ways, positivity and so on, but it's the same fundamental mechanism.
Yeah, it's so interesting. A lot, in Classcraft, one of the things we really care about is creating opportunities for collaboration. And a lot of people think games, they think competition. And, my prevailing sense is there's enough competition in schools already. Like we don't need to add more.
Exactly.
And in fact, we need to teach collaboration. And the best way to do that is to practice it. And so that's a mind shift set for a lot of people. The idea that kids their success is interdependent and you can win even if you are not, the team wins even if you're not the best is like exists in sports, but we tend to not want to do that in school.
The other thing is that some games are what are called zero-sum games. Somebody wins, somebody else loses.
Yeah.
The net is zero. But in a life, usually what is the equivalent of games is not zero-sum. Everybody can lose. Everybody can win. And so if you treat it as a zero-sum game, then you're constantly minimizing the actual outcome for yourself and everybody else. So even recognizing what kind of situation you're in and whether it's zero-sum or not is something that we don't teach, but that we really should be doing.
That's super interesting. I've never thought of that before, but that's for sure the case of what's happening in a lot of competitive settings and frameworks in school.
Yeah.
And it's so demotivating when, because, our philosophy around motivation has always been that if you make it competitive, you're going to motivate the people who think they can win. Right.
And everybody else will just give up,
Exactly. They're like, I'm at the bottom of this leaderboard. I got, 30 other kids above me. I'll never beat all of them.
Exactly.
I can't win, to heck with it. Yeah.
It just labels me as the loser.
Yeah.
And even the leaderboards, I mean, you see people with t-shirts, second place is the first loser. So
you
get this kind of very negative, very, very negative attitudes about competition.
And it's interesting because, again, the people who like competitive scenarios for motivation are people who are motivated by that, right? So it's again using that narrow lens of what motivates me motivates other people. And going back to your point about UD for motivation.
Well, what we need to do more of with people who have that drive, and I have that drive. I mean, that's part of being human, I think, is to have a competitive drive.
For sure.
Is to try to channel it into competing against yourself. It's not so much that you have to always be better than Jimmy or Joan. It's that today I'm better than I was yesterday, and the day after I'm going to be.
That's really profound, Chris. I want to just take a pause here.
Well, I don't think I'd original.
I still think it's profound. We need the reminder. We need to channel competitive energies into competing against ourselves. What I think is powerful about that from an education standpoint is quite often enough we're not giving students enough feedback so that they can do that, because they're not able to compete against themselves because they don't have the information to do that.
Yeah. And if the leaderboard, and again, I don't want to attack leaderboards in and of themselves.
Of course.
But if there was a leaderboard that said, which person grew the most since yesterday?
That's right.
That order might be really different than the order on the kind of proficiency leaderboard. And as a teacher, you would say the student who was at the top of the class was the one who gained the most yesterday, not the student who's kind of resting on their laurels.
or if every student had a leaderboard of themselves and they're competing against past versions of themselves, like where they were at before, right?
I mean, I experienced this in my own life. I went to I had very poor pre-college education. Um, Not because I was low SES, but I was just in really terrible public and private schools. And I was very tenacious, so I got into Caltech anyway. I kind of taught myself calculus because it wasn't taught in the schools I was in. And then I got to Caltech, and it was horrendous. I mean, I was up against all these people who had gone to really good schools, and they were playing cards every night and playing pool every night and having fun, and I was just sweating blood up in my room trying to, not catch up even, but just to stay in school. But in my sophomore year, we finally got past everything they'd learned in high school. They were used to playing cards and playing pool. I was used to studying like hell, and a lot of them flunked out. And there I was, still
just
going
trucking along. Yeah, that's
so,
super interesting.
You can't. You have to take the long view in a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm. That's super interesting. So, we're coming up on time. You've been working with educators and hearing all these great stories with the silver linings. Teaching right now in America is a position that is not the most popular. So we got a lot of people, coming into the education system that, weren't necessarily planning on it. What if you had any advice for teachers starting their careers today? What would that be?
Well, what we see in these Silver Lining for Learning episodes, and I hope that people will come and take a look. You can look at the archives. You can look at what's coming up this Saturday, see if it's something that's of interest to you. The most compelling and transformative innovations we celebrate are the ones that are student-centered. They're not curriculum-centered. They're not teacher-centered. They're not assessment-centered. They're student-centered. And those people also, when they come onto the show, they are just glowing. They're just glowing with joy, which is not true of teachers by and large, because they're experiencing the true magic and power of the situation, which is the wonderful interactions with students when you're centering on the student and not centering on these other things. But our system is not set up that way. So then you have to be transformative. Then you have to be disruptive. Then you have to be a leader. And that is a burden to carry. But if you care enough about the students, it's a burden that you're willing to take on. So that would be my advice to teachers. If you can't get excited about your students, don't go into the profession. And if you are excited about your students, make them the center, and you'll find that you're doing transformative things that maybe will get you onto Silver Lining for Learning.
That's a great advice. Our new tagline at Classcraft is "Relationships are everything."
Wonderful.
And I really believe in what you're saying. So thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy person. I'm honored and really happy that we were able to have this conversation and share it with everybody listening. Have a lot of gratitude for you taking the time to do that.
I'm a big fan of Classcraft. As you know, we feature you as a case in the course, and I'm grateful for the time you put into that. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, and good luck with the AI research.
We'll
see how it all plays out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.